All right, hello students. Welcome back to Mr. Lawhon's AP European History class. Boy, today are we going to talk about a saucy, spicy subject. Whatever the words that you use, we're going to pour the tea. We're going to listen to the chisme. Whatever words you guys use. But that's what we're going to talk about. Man, is there some major scandal going on today in our notes. So let's not waste a lot of time. We've been talking about the Reformation, and yesterday we talked about Calvinism and how the peace at Augsburg kind of made Protestantism, at least Lutheranism, there to stay in the Holy Roman Empire. Well, today we're going to shift our focus to England, and we're going to talk about essential question 3.5, what factors are going to trigger the English Reformation? So now we're going to see the Reformation spread to England. Pause if you need to. Okay, the English Reformation begins. All right, so before we talk about the English Reformation, let's talk about a little background, a little context, all right? So if you remember way back in chapter 1, we talked about how England and France were kind of trying to exert their power over the Catholic Church, and they started to try to tax the Catholic Church, and that kind of started this war of words back and forth where they would pass a tax, and then the Pope would issue a papal bull saying that we don't have to pay the tax, we're the church. Well, bottom line is, England had tried to kind of exert its control over the church prior to the Hundred Years' War. Now, it ended with the church saying, we are above the kings, we are above, royal law. But they were trying to. So you see this beef going back and forth between England and the Catholic Church. Then in the 1520s, all right, remember 1517 was the 95 Theses. By 3 years later, some of Luther's writings were being smuggled into England. So guys, remember the printing press, right? Look at the effects the printing press is having. It is spreading Luther's ideas all over Europe, and that is getting out there. Now, who is the king of England in the 1520s? The legendary king, Henry VIII. All right, so here's a portrait of Henry VIII. Some of you will know his story well once I start really getting into it. Some of you guys might be like, man, where have I heard that name before? Trust me, he's got a legendary story. Now, at first, Henry VIII, when the Reformation broke out, was a very faithful Catholic, and he defended the church against Luther's ideas. He actually condemned Luther's ideas in writing, and then Luther kind of, smirked at him and said, okay, whatever. But anyway, he stood up for the church and earned him like a title from the Pope, like Defender of the Faith. But you're going to see that's very quickly going to change. Now, I'll be honest with you, English Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, he was an English cardinal, English high-ranking church member, and Henry's chief minister, was the same guy, they're going to guide Henry at first to oppose the Reformation. So Henry is just kind of, in his own mind, against the Reformation when it starts. And he's got advisors like Thomas Wolsey that are going to continue to push him away from the Reformation and these ideas. But you're going to see, guys, when it gets personal and when Henry VIII has an idea, there's nothing that's going to stop him from reforming the English church. All right? Stop. All right. Pause if you need to. All right, now let's talk about where it gets personal. All right, the king's marriage. So, guys, this is going to be kind of confusing, so pay attention. You're going to see all these little connections. All right. So Henry VIII was married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon. Now you might think in your mind, where have I heard that name, Aragon? As in the kingdom of Aragon? As in Aragon and Castile uniting and making the kingdom of Spain? Yes, that Aragon. As a matter of fact, Catherine of Aragon is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. So you remember, Ferdinand and Isabella, they got married, and that kind of united Castile and Aragon, and they created the Kingdom of Spain, and then that started all of the exploration that's going to happen. Eventually, they are going to fund Columbus's journey to the Indies, which ends up being America. But guess who else is related to Catherine of Aragon? Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor that we've been talking about, that's been fighting Lutheran states in the Schmalkaldic League, right? So Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, is related to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon is the auntie of Charles V. All right, so anyway, look at these connections here. Now, Catherine was married to Henry VIII's brother originally, but Henry VIII's brother died. And Henry's father betrothed him, basically forced him to marry Catherine. Now, why would he force his son to marry the wife of his dead brother? Well, the idea is this. He wanted to keep an alliance between England and Spain and keep them from war. So what did he do? He sent his son to marry Catherine of Aragon so that alliance would be held intact. So think about this. Catherine of Aragon is a daughter of Spain, all right, is an aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, and she was the wife to his now deceased brother. Now here's the problem, though. There wasn't really a problem. They'd been married for 18 years, but when you want something to be a problem, you can make it a problem. And here's something that's going to be made into a problem. Technically, Catholic law stated that one was not allowed to marry the wife of one's brother. Okay, they said, look, you can't marry your brother's wife. It kind of goes back to the way people interpret the Old Testament, especially the book of Leviticus. Those were the laws given to the Hebrew people. But anyway, so in order to get this marriage happen and make this alliance happen, they had to get special papal permission. All right? So anyway, bottom line is they get the permission, the Pope approves, Henry VIII marries Catherine of Aragon, and they're married for 18 years before the beef really starts. All right? Now what's the beef? Well, here's the deal. Henry and Catherine had one daughter, and that daughter's name was Mary. Okay. Now you might say, like, so what? You have a daughter. What's the problem? Well, here's the deal, guys. It's not that a queen couldn't rule over Europe, but there was this attitude that people had that queens don't make very good rulers, and queens probably shouldn't be ruling over men. So one of the things that's bothering Henry is that if he dies, or when he dies, his heir is going to be a daughter. All right. And he thinks that if he dies and his heir is a daughter, then there's going to be more war in England, more civil war in England. Remember the War of the Roses that we talked about? And he doesn't want that. So Henry becomes obsessed with the idea of he needs a male heir to the throne. And Catherine has given him a daughter, but Catherine's also had several miscarriages. So Henry VIII doesn't believe that Catherine is going to be the one to give him a male heir. So Henry is going to look elsewhere to produce a legitimate male heir. Pause if you need to. Okay, the King's affair. Well, Henry wants a male heir, and he falls in love with one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, and her name is Anne Boleyn. Now, you might say, what's a lady-in-waiting? It is just an attendant to a royal person, all right? A very close person to the queen. And her name was Anne Boleyn. So almost one of Catherine of Aragon's like homies, or at least the women that wait on her and help her get dressed and that take care of her, right? As queen. So anyway, Anne Boleyn is a younger woman, and Henry VIII is infatuated with her, and he starts to think, what if me and Anne Boleyn get married, and maybe we can have a son, and then I'll have a male heir on the throne. All right, that sounds like a decent idea. The only problem is, guys, getting out of a marriage in 1500 Europe is not an easy thing, especially if you are royalty. So, in order to marry Anne Boleyn and divorce Catherine of Aragon, he would need the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine. All right, now, what does it mean to annul? What's the difference between annulment and divorce? Basically, in this sense, they're very similar. All right, they're different, but in this sense, they're very similar. Basically, annul means make your marriage not valid, all right? Claim that it wasn't valid. And he's going to argue that it wasn't valid because he married his wife's or his brother's wife. And he's going to say, oh, look, again, that's against Catholic law, right? So anyway, guys, he's going to try to get this annulment and get rid of his wife. Now, here's the problem with that. there's a lot of wars going on, right? France and the Turks are invading the whole Roman Empire. And there's this instance in the 1520s, guys, I think it's 1527, where the city of Rome, where the Pope lives, is sacked by soldiers in mutiny. See, there were these soldiers and they were angry about not being paid and they were near Rome. So guess what they said? Let's go destroy Rome. So what they did was they sacked Rome, and Clement VII, the Pope, became a prisoner of Charles V. Now, here's why this is important. The only person that can annul the marriage of Henry VIII is the Pope. Now, the problem is now the Pope is under the prisoner of Charles V, all right? He is a prisoner of Charles V. So, Charles V, the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, is probably not going to be like, yeah, we'll let Henry divorce my auntie, all right? Not going to happen, okay? So, that's one strike against Henry VIII. But Henry VIII tries to get an annulment anyway. So he sends Wolsey to go ask for the annulment, but he fails to get the annulment. So guess what? Henry VIII, absolutely angry that his Cardinal Wolsey can't get the annulment, disgraces him, fires him from his post, and replaces him with two people, Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. Now, who are these guys? By the way, guys, heads up, there's going to be a lot of Thomases, so maybe we should just call them by their last name, all right? So anyway, Cranmer and Cromwell, even though that sounds pretty similar too. Now, what is the deal with Cranmer and Cromwell? Well, guys, they are very much believers in Luther's ideas and the Reformation. So they both have Lutheran sympathies, which means they're like, yeah, you know what? This Luther guy, he makes some good points. And now these guys are going to become the new main advisors to Henry VIII. Pause if you need to. Okay, the Reformation Parliament. So, guys, now that Wolsey's gone, and even though Henry VIII cannot get an annulment, they get together and they start to talk with his advisors, and Henry starts to think, and Parliament starts to think, what if we made our own church, the Church of England, and Henry, you become basically the head of the Church of England, basically like the Pope of the Church of England. What if we broke away and made our own church? Then, Henry, you could make whatever religious rules you want. You could grant yourself an annulment. And that, guys, is the idea. All right? So for 7 years, between 1529 and 1536, Parliament began passing laws. It's called the Reformation Parliament because these laws are essentially going to break England away from the Roman Catholic Church. All right? So they're going to pass several laws that change religion in England. The first law, 1531, Henry VIII is recognized as the head of the Church of England. Now, guys, now that Henry is basically in charge of all of the church, which means, guys, all the churches, all right, the church as one group, the English churches, he's now the head of the English churches, guys. So if he wants to say, I give myself an annulment so I can put my wife aside and take on a new wife, he can now do that. In 1532, a law was passed by Parliament that placed English clergy under royal control. Basically, if the priests disagreed with having Henry as the head of the church, it doesn't matter because, guys, now the clergy are under the control of the king. So they kind of have to do what the king says now. 1533, Henry VIII put aside his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and married Anne Boleyn, who was already pregnant when they got married. So they were well on their way to having their very first child, all right? So they get married, guys, and Catherine of Aragon is put away, which you can kind of makes, which kind of probably you can understand makes Charles V a little bit angry, makes the Pope outraged, and probably makes Catherine of Aragon a little upset, and, their daughter Mary too, but we'll get to that later. All right, now in 1533, Cranmer becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now you might be like, what is the Archbishop of Canterbury? Well, guys, in England, that is the highest level of religious office in England. If you are the Archbishop or the Archbishop of Canterbury, then you are the highest, highest religious official. Okay? All right, now, 1535, England Parliament passes the Act of Supremacy. And that made Henry VIII the supreme head on earth of a new church called the Anglican Church. So the Act of Supremacy is what severed the ties between the Roman Catholic Church and the churches of England. From now on, England is going to have its own church called the Anglican Church. Now, if you don't think this sent shockwaves all across Europe, you're out of your mind. Luther wasn't trying to start a new church. He was trying to fix the Catholic Church, all right? But it started splinters, right? It started breaking away. He didn't mean to, but that's what happened. But here is a guy that is full on breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church and making his own church. Why? Well, so he could divorce his wife, right? Now, Thomas More. You might be like, who is Thomas More? Well, guys, way back in the Renaissance, he was an English intellectual, and he was also one of the advisors to King Henry VIII. And he was a good friend of Erasmus. And although Thomas More, very much like Erasmus, criticized the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church, he never thought that England should create its own church with its own head and break away. So Thomas More says, this is wrong, Henry VIII. You shouldn't be doing this. And guess what Henry VIII does? He has Thomas More arrested, tried, and executed, beheaded. Oof, big oof. So, Henry VIII basically makes it very clear that nobody should challenge me on this ever again. Pause if you need to. All right, now here is where we get into the sauciness or the spiciness or the tea, the chisme of Henry VIII's legendary life, all right? The wives of Henry VIII. Well, guys, here's the deal. Henry VIII and Anne, when Anne finally gives birth, it is a daughter. Oh, man, he didn't get that son he wanted. And they name her Elizabeth, and although they try to have other kids, they don't have a son. So guess what? Henry VIII is frustrated. He wanted a male heir. So, now there's a lot going on with this, guys. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. But basically, he accuses Anne of treason and adultery, and she's beheaded. So, Henry swipes left there. She's beheaded, guys. I executed Henry VIII, this woman that he caused such an uproar over. He caused her, he had her head cut off. All right. Now, Henry VIII marries Jane Seymour, who was one of Anne Boleyn's ladies in waiting. So in 1536, he marries Jane Seymour. Now, Henry VIII, in his letters and his writings, described Jane Seymour as the absolute love of his life. But she dies shortly after giving birth to, yes, a son, Edward VI. So he finally gets a son, but not too long after, he loses his wife, probably due to complications in childbirth. You see, guys, giving birth back in the day was a very, 50-50 chance almost that the wife or the mother could face some several severe consequences and die in childbirth. So she died not long after. And guys, Henry VIII was devastated. But guess what? He marries again. Now, his next marriage was advised by Thomas Cromwell. Now, he said, look, you need to marry Anne of Cleves because she was a German noble, and the idea was we could unite England with German Protestants, and if Charles V and the Roman Catholic Church with their armies try to come after us, we will have an alliance with German Protestants. And what happens is Henry VIII agrees after seeing a portrait of her. So he looks, it's almost like he's looking on social media and he sees a picture of her and he says, ooh, yeah, I want to marry her. And then when he meets her in real life, he realizes, and guys, he doesn't stay married very long and he divorces her and he has Thomas Cromwell executed. All right, imagine that. All right, so swipe left on Anne of Cleves. All right, and Thomas Cromwell, the guy that suggested the marriage, is executed. All right, next, Catherine Howard. Now, next he marries Catherine Howard. Now, some people say that there was this big controversy that she was 15 years old when she was married. We now know, guys, that she was probably more like 18, 19, or 20 years old, which is still pretty young because he's 49. So anyway, guys, she was 19 years old at marriage and was not probably, guys, but she was very promiscuous with other people. I mean, can you imagine being a 19-year-old, you're married to this 49-year-old that you're not really attracted to? So she cheats around on him, and guess what? He has her executed in 1542. Bye-bye to her. And then finally, Henry VIII marries Catherine Parr, the sixth wife. Now, Catherine Parr was probably a good match for Henry because she herself had been divorced 3 times. So they get married, guys, and Catherine Parr is going to actually be the one that survives Henry because Henry VIII dies into his marriage with Catherine Parr. So, guys, that quickly is the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, which, like I said, is a pretty legendary story. If you want to remember his 6 wives, there's a little rhyme that goes, divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. And that is kind of the rhyme that helps people remember what happened to the 6 wives of Henry VIII. By the way, guys, it's a great musical in Hollywood I saw last summer called Eight. Or wait, no, check that. It was called Six. What I say it was called Eight, Henry VIII. It was called Six. And it was a musical, guys, at the Pantages down in Hollywood. And it was about the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And it was a musical told from their perspective. And it was really good and really funny. So, highly recommend it, guys, if you ever get a chance to see it, or listen to the music on YouTube or something. Six, because the songs are very funny and they make fun of like Henry VIII. Anyway, so pause if you need to. All right, guys, the Church of England. So, guys, one of the big things is we're going to ask ourselves, how far did Henry VIII really go with being Protestant? And the answer is, guys, not very far. Why? Because, guys, he wasn't trying to create a new church because he disagreed with Catholic doctrine. He was trying to create a new church so he could divorce his wife. All right, so one of the things that they did was they did use Bibles that were translated into English. All right. Now, the Roman Catholic Church, guys, doesn't like Bibles translated into the vernacular because they don't believe that the average person should be reading the Bible because they think it's too complicated for the average person to read. Heck, they think it's too complicated for trained people to understand. All right. But as you saw from the movie that we talked about, we've been watching Martin Luther, the movie Luther. Luther was like, more people need to read the Bible, right? But remember, that's a danger to the Roman Catholic Church. So they began to use Bibles translated to English so that more English people can actually read the Bible. Now, Henry was the head of the church, not the Pope, and that's a Protestant thing too. So 2 things, you're reading the Bible in your vernacular, and you don't believe in the Pope, all right? I guess you've kind of got your own Pope. But I'll be honest with you, Henry VIII did not agree with Protestant ideas. Remember, he's the one that defended the Catholic Church before he wanted to divorce his wife and had a reason to be angry with them. So he was angered by most Protestant views. He did not agree with Luther's ideas. And as king, he actually issued what are called the 6 Articles. Now, what do the 6 Articles say? It basically said, look, priests cannot marry. Luther and Zwingli and those guys are pushing for, hey, priests, whatever should be able to marry. He, very much like the Catholic Church, says priests should not marry. All right. Transubstantiation, which is the literal presence of Christ in the body and the blood, is right, just like the Catholic Church says. He basically largely agrees with the Catholic Church practices and teachings. He says the church is right about the sacraments. The church says there's 8 sacraments. I think Henry VIII said there were 7, which is pretty much the same as the Catholic Church. So bottom line is, Henry VIII is really not trying to change things. And if you went to worship in the Anglican Church during this time period, you probably couldn't tell the difference between it and going to a Roman Catholic Mass. All right? So at first, guys, they weren't very Protestant. Pause if you need to. All right, now let's talk about his son. Now remember, guys, Henry VIII had one son with Jane Seymour, and he was 10 years old when he took the throne. Now, one of the things that you'll see throughout history is that when a king comes to power very young, they are usually kind of mentored by some kind of co-regent, some kind of official. Sometimes it's the Queen Mother. Sometimes it is like a wealthy noble, like a lord or duke. And in this case, guys, it is a duke. All right, so Edward was counseled by this guy named Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. A duke, guys, is just a royal landowner in an area. Okay, now Edward Seymour was in correspondence talking to John Calvin. So, guys, Edward Seymour, the guy that is counseling a very young and impressionable Edward VI, is taking messages from John Calvin. So guys, that England is about ready to get really reformed. Okay? So, Edward and Seymour, guys, one of the things that Seymour kind of convinces Edward to do is repeal the 6 Articles of his father that kind of confirmed all of these Catholic ideas. In 1549, Seymour and Edward are going to work together with Parliament and pass what's called the Act of Uniformity. Basically, this forces all churches to use an English Book of Common Prayer. Now, you might be like, what is a Book of Common Prayer? Well, guys, in Catholic churches and Lutheran churches and in Anglican churches, they have like a book that contains prayers that you read aloud all together and songs that you sing all together and kind of sermons that you kind of read from. And these are all, before this, they used to read from the Roman Catholic Book of Common Prayer. Well, now they have their own English Book of Common Prayer. Once again, it's another break from the Roman Catholic Church. And then guess what else they started to do, which is very much of John Calvin? They started to remove all images, all pictures, all altars, all relics, all of those things that John Calvin was against, and they start to remove that from English churches. So here you get that iconoclasm that is going to get rid of all of these things. They're all idols. Get them out of the church. Then, guys, in 1552, the Second Act of Uniformity was passed, which confirmed some of Luther's ideas, like, hey, we are justified or saved by faith and faith alone. All right. Another thing in the Second Act of Uniformity was, hey, the scriptures are all we need. We don't need the Pope to tell us what to do. We can all read the scriptures for ourselves, which is sola scriptura, right? The Luther idea that all we need is the scriptures alone. That's it. And guys, the Second Act of Uniformity denied transubstantiation. It said the literal body of Christ is not in the bread and the wine, but rather the spiritual body of Christ and the spiritual blood. So it's consubstantiation instead of transubstantiation, and recognized only two sacraments, baptism and communion. So guys, you see, under Edward VI, they're going to become very, very Protestant, right? Now, here's the problem, though. Unfortunately for Edward VI, he's going to die in his teens. And who's going to take over? Well, the eldest child of Henry VIII, which is Mary, the original daughter of Catherine and Henry. And Mary, guys, is going to be known for trying to steer England back to the Catholic Church. But that's a story for another time. So there you have it, guys. The English Reformation has begun. And we've learned about Henry VIII's 6 wives. And now England has become Protestant. Guys, that's the end of the notes. I'll see you in class.